Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. A dictator in Moscow orders the invasion of a smaller Eastern European neighbor. Everyone predicts that his troops will swiftly overrun the weaker country, but instead its citizens mount a ferocious and well-organized resistance that forces him to drastically change his plans. Meanwhile, debate rages in Western Europe and the United States about how, or even whether, to support the resistance. All of this will sound familiar to anyone who's been following the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it also describes the events of the so-called Winter War, when the Soviet Union invaded Finland in 1939. That conflict provided the backdrop for Robert E. Sherwood's play There Shall Be No Night, which became a hit on New York and London stages during the Second World War and won him his third Pulitzer Prize for drama. Today we're joined by Dr. Thomas F. Connolly, whose article Rewriting Finland's Winter War in the Journal of American Drama and Theater explores the play's history. Dr. Connolly is a professor of humanities and social sciences at Prince Mohammed bin Fahd University and fellow at the Center for Futuristic Studies. He's also the author of Genus Envy, Nationalities, Identities, and the Performing Body of Work. He's also the author of the forthcoming Goodbye Good Ol' USA, What America Lost in World War II, which explores film, propaganda, and popular culture. Tom, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm delighted to talk to you today.
Robert E. Sherwood is one of those historical figures who had a major impact on his own time, but who has now been, I would say, largely forgotten. Who was he, and why does he matter?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about this. The theater that Robert E. Sherwood wrote for has been gone for, I would say, 3 generations. Sherwood comes from a literary tradition and theatrical tradition that was perfectly suited for a career such as his. A writer who emerged during the 1920s, came to achieve great respect and eminence during the 1930s and 40s. He was first known as a member of the Algonquin Roundtable, which, again, it's incredible to me since I knew about them in my childhood, but these are a group of writers who have pretty much vanished from consciousness. I think people still know about Dorothy Parker, who was the wittiest woman in America. And even though George S. Kaufman and Moss Hart's plays are still performed, most famously The Man Who Came to Dinner, Kaufman himself, is not a figure that readily comes to mind even in American theater, young American theater historians today. Sherwood was a Harvard graduate. He was 6'7" tall, tried to enlist in the American Army, but was rejected because of his height, volunteered for a Black Watch Regiment in the Canadian forces, was grievously wounded. Both his legs were filled with shrapnel. This gave him pain throughout his life. And World War I turned him into an absolute pacifist. He returns from the war, begins writing for New York publications. He's actually the first serious American film critic, in addition to being a playwright and historian and speechwriter for Franklin Roosevelt. Sherwood was by far the most serious of the Algonquin Roundtable. Alexander Wolcott would later say, of all of us, he's the one who used the stuff he had in him best. And he was referring to the play we're talking about today. Sherwood came to an agonizing crossroads with the rise of fascism. He rejected his pacifism and became an absolute booster for war and was very eager for the United States to join the Allies and fight against Hitler. He joined the Roosevelt administration, giving up his tremendously successful writing career to become a speechwriter for FDR. And he famously coined the phrase arsenal of democracy to promote the Lend-Lease program to give material and munition aid to Britain while it was fighting alone against the Nazis. He battled depression throughout his life and never felt that he was living up to his own talent. He complained that he always started out to write a serious play with a message and ended up writing a drawing room comedy. This isn't quite true, but his self-deprecation, even in the face of Pulitzer Prizes, including one for history for his biography, his joint biography, Roosevelt and Hopkins, shows you some of the personal conflicts that he had. And it will come up in our discussion of the play.
Yeah, I understand that the play is, in the very least, in terms of its content, in terms of its message, as you've been hinting, a little bit of a turn from what he'd been writing in earlier in the 1930s. What is There Shall Be No Night about?
It takes place in Finland. Its protagonist is a Nobel Prize winning philosopher who has his latest book is something called The Defense of Man. It's one of those, it's modeled on those massive books of the 1930s and 20s and 30s, like, Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West and Toynbee's Outline of History and H.G. Wells's historical tome, which attempt to explain the nature of civilization, the nature of society, and come to grips with the chaos and terror that were engulfing the world in the early 20th century. Like Robert Sherwood, the Professor Valkonen, the protagonist, is a pacifist, absolutely devoted to the cause of world peace, yet he's also a Finnish patriot. And this is one of the secondary issues in the play that represents a transition for Sherwood. One of his most successful earlier plays was Idiot's Delight, which based its humor on mocking the idea of nationalism and ethnicity. Here, the Finns are depicted as they would be in American and Allied propaganda once the war started, as brave little Finland, this noble culture defending itself against the onslaught of the Soviet behemoth. Forced to confront the invasion, Valkonen gradually adapts his position. When his son joins the partisans and is killed, the final scene is the good doctor strapping on a pistol along with his Red Cross armband and going to the front to fight. There's a lot of discussion in the play about the master race. There are Nazi sympathizers in the play, and there's much of the play is a debate between the idea of the Nazi New Order and even the idea of communism and mass society, and the inevitability of the destruction of democracy, which is belied by Valkonen's speeches about the glory that was Greece and the grandeur of democratic Western civilization, and something that is worth fighting and dying for, which the fascists and communists in the play don't think liberals will do. So Valkonen enacts the defense of democracy at the end of the play by marching off to war.
You mentioned that Sherwood kind of had this feeling that he always starts out trying to write something serious, ends up with, as he put it, a drawing room comedy. And in some ways, the two actors that he was so closely connected with, the Lunts, Alfred Lunt and Lynn Fontanne, maybe arguably had something similar going on in their careers. Could you tell us a little bit about the Lunts and maybe their involvement in the original production of this play?
Yes, the Lunts, again, like Robert Sherwood, are towering figures of mid-20th century American theater. No two actors ever, perhaps Catherine Cornell is in the same league, who devoted their lives entirely to the theater. They barely appeared on film or television. The Lunts made one film and appeared a few times on television, but really not only devoted themselves to Broadway, but also toured extensively all around America. Any mid-sized, even small houses, they played in their hits. And while they did appear in serious plays, The Seagull, both of them were in plays by Eugene O'Neill, but they made their career together. They were married, and most of their career was performing in light comedies, in which they were absolutely unparalleled. They also were a favorite acting duo for Noel Coward. With him, they performed in the original production of Design for Living. And they were, toward the end of their careers, they were criticized a bit for not really stretching themselves and not trying to do more serious work. But Lunt himself, I won't say he was bitter, but he was mystified by the fact, he said, why didn't the Theater Guild offer us Long Day's Journey into Night? He didn't understand why, but it was because years of touring in comedies by S.N. Berman and they were in Idiot's Delight by Robert Sherwood, had given them the reputation of light comic actors. So for them, I think there's a parallel between their theatrical performance ambitions and Sherwood's ambitions to write a serious, timely play that would have a tremendous impact on the political feelings in the United States and galvanize Americans to recognize their duty to help the Allies. So they took up this performance. They were incredibly meticulous performers. Lunt would call for full dress rehearsals the last week of a run. During the run of The Visit, in the last play that they did, the dark drama by Dürrenmatt, Lunt debated whether he should have 3 or 2 pebbles in his shoe to impact his gait while he was walking as this loser character, Anton Schill. Peter Brook, to this day, claims that Lunt was the greatest actor that he ever worked with. And their work in There Shall Be No Night, for them, was not just an acting performance. It was a consecration of their ideals of art, citizenship, and civilization, really. I mean, the very high-minded attitude towards the theater and their art.
So in addition to Sherwood and the Lunts, there are a few other people connected with this production. Maybe one name in particular that will be familiar to fans of movies from the 1940s, 1950s.
Oh, Montgomery Clift. Montgomery Clift played the son, and he was very much a protege of the Lunts. He acted in their company, and they absolutely gave him the confidence to pursue his career. If you know anything at all about Clift's insecurities, I'm sorry to laugh, but he really was a bundle of neuroses and hesitation. They really urged him to go forward with his career and had tremendous admiration for him. And Clift made a mark in this play. It was one of the performances that led to his getting a Hollywood contract. Also, even though the Lunts themselves disdained Hollywood, they always encouraged the younger members of their company to go on and pursue their careers as they saw fit. There was no, the Lunts did not at all discourage Clift from going to Hollywood.
So this has a very successful run on Broadway. As I think we've discussed, it brings Sherwood one of his, 4 Pulitzers ultimately that he
3,
won?
Yeah.
3, okay.
Yeah.
Then it goes to London, which is, I think, a pretty interesting place to put on this kind of play in the 1940s. What changed during that part of the run?
Several things. First of all, by the time it goes to London, London's already under attack. But Sherwood had to rewrite the play because the Finns allied themselves with Hitler in order to fight off the Russians. And also the Kamanheim, the Finnish leader, was identified as a fascist. I didn't mention that Sherwood, while gaining almost unanimous critical raves for the play, was viciously attacked by the right and left for writing the play. The left attacked him, particularly Lillian Hellman, the unrepentant Stalinist congenital liar, went after him because he, broke with the Popular Front. Isolationists from the right attacked him for being a warmonger. He was actually physically assaulted in a theater in the Midwest by a young man who accused him of selling out to the war interests and betraying his pacifist ideals. And Sherwood, when he wrote a published preface to the play, defended himself and explained, as any reasonable person would agree, this was no time for pacifism. The forces of Nazism and fascism had to be fought at every turn. But nonetheless, he recognized Finland was no longer, an immaculate subject. So he relocated the play to Greece. By this time, the German and Italian forces having invaded Greece. He even changes the location of the penultimate scene of the play to a classroom near Thermopylae to, if in case anybody was nodding, absolutely get the resonance. He changed some of the quotations from the Finnish national epic, the Kalevala, to quotations from Pericles' funeral oration. The final published version relocates the play to its original spot, Finland, but he kept the quotations from Pericles. After Sherwood's death, there was a television adaptation with one of Catherine Cornell's few screen performances, which another writer, Wishengrad, readapted it to Hungary, since this was 1956, and that was the time of the Soviet invasion of Hungary. But the production in London is really extraordinary. Very often, performances were interrupted by bombs. There's a line in the play, the enemy is very near, and several times that line was spoken and a real bomb would explode. The end of the run was literally caused by a direct hit on the theater. The play was hit by a V-1 rocket. An RAF fighter pilot was actually killed in the midst of buying a ticket for the show. But the play took London by storm. It was packed houses, a tremendous emotional impact. Winston Churchill came to see it, although he gave Sherwood some dramatic criticism. He advised him to add a scene in the play where the characters discussed the invasion of Czechoslovakia. And this is a testament to the lifelike performance of the Luntz. The reason Churchill asked him this was, he said, I want to know what these characters would say about Czechoslovakia, which is, Churchill's an incredibly sophisticated man. And yet to be completely caught up in these characters as though they were living people, there can't be a greater testament to the timeliness of the dialogue and the lifelike performance of the Luntz.
While the Luntz are performing this play in London, I understand that there's a particularly extraordinary moment where they perform it outside of the theater. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
They were invited to a private home to give a performance literally in a drawing room, performing among the house guests, not set back, not in any kind of a stage, not in any kind of a separated performance space. They were literally among the guests, speaking the dialogue as though it were conversation. The guests who watched the performance were absolutely riveted. They were frozen in awe at what they beheld. And one of the criticisms of the Luntz by the ignorant is that they were merely technical, superficial performers. The method proponents will like to hold them up as an example of what, Brando and even Montgomery Clift in his way swept away. This is absolute nonsense. I mean, try to imagine Al Pacino giving a performance in your living room that you would think would leave you breathless and frozen in awe. I'm not, everyone has their own style. Whatever works on stage is great as far as I'm concerned. But to misunderstand the technique of the Luntz, which was so rich, and an absolute, ascetic devotion to their art, to their style of performance. This performance also sums up the problem with the play. Here you've got it being performed in a living room during the war, and people are caught in a momentary illusion that this is really happening. Well, what's really happening are, V-1 rockets destroying buildings, and walking out of the theater or walking out of that room and knowing someone whose son or husband or brother was killed in the war, that absolutely destroys that illusion. During the final weeks of the play, when the bombing was really getting worse, attendance started to fall off. The reality of the war became too much. And this, as I argue in my article, really shows the fundamental, the fatal problem of attempting to dramatize history. There's the facts of history, the destruction that is occurring in London versus the acting out of the consequences of war on stage, and the disconnection, the discontinuity between historical reality and dramatizing history is simply impossible to sustain.
One thing in your description of the play's history, I'm struck by, on the one hand, it's this very timely play, right? That's, here's what's happening now in 1939, 1940, and here's how Sherwood sees the need to respond to it. On the other hand, it's striking how easily it seems it was adapted. Finland becomes complicated because of their alliance with the Nazis. So then it goes to Greece. Then there's this later version you mentioned that's, set in Hungary. I'm curious, that seems like a paradox. Like it's very timely, very specific, but on the other hand, very easily adaptable. Could you just explain that a little bit?
Well, as we can see right now in Ukraine, the advances, the imperialist depredations of dictators, wars of aggression have always been with us. That basic plot line unfortunately is eternal. The problem with the play is the speechifying of the characters, not to mention the fact that authors in those days thought nothing of having a cast of 25 actors, which today, at least in the United States, is only possible in a subsidized university theater, or in England in the National Theater, maybe a continental national theater. One critic, George E. Nathan, wrote that Sherwood, taking a lesson from the 1930s living newspaper plays, has provided what can be called the living editorial. And while the play is very timely and very dramatic and has tremendous theatrical impact when there's an actual conflict going on, taken out of the context of the immediate conflict, the play loses its dramatic impact and sounds like, liberal parlor talk or, a cocktail party politics, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm struck. You mentioned in your article how the play becomes dated, in your words, very quickly. So there again, there's this kind of complicated paradoxical thing going on where it seems very relevant in some ways again, but at the same time, as you're talking about, George G. Nathan points out it's speechifying. It doesn't work very well outside of that immediate context. What larger kind of point, I guess, can we get, or what lesson can we draw from this about how theatrical tastes change, how we look back on the theatrical legacy of American drama, that lost world that you were kind of talking about at the beginning of the interview that Sherwood and the Luntz belonged to?
Well, it's a multi-level problem. As I said, the physical production aspect that Robert Sherwood and the Playwrights Company worked in, where they thought nothing of a cast of at least 12, where they could count on touring the nation and even performing in London. Try to imagine a 2.5-hour play with a cast of 28, opening in Boston, going to New Haven, maybe Washington, then opening in New York, running for a couple of years, and then the cast gets on a train and goes all over America. That sounds like a Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland movie. Also, the idea that, can you imagine President Biden asking Tony Kushner to become his speechwriter? Or can you imagine Paula Vogel being on TikTok? It just, that doesn't happen. But, Sherwood and the Algonquin Roundtable, I didn't want to use this word, but influencers doesn't begin to convey the impact that their taste had. Sherwood's colleague, Alexander Woolcott, was on the radio in a program called The Town Crier. He's the subject of Kaufman and Hart's play, The Man Who Came to Dinner. He mentioned Goodbye, Mr. Chips, the novel, which was subsequently filmed. It immediately became a bestseller. He also mentioned Lost Horizon. These books became instant mega bestsellers. Sherwood, even when under attack by right and left, never lost his eminence and his stature as a significant American cultural figure. He was able to enter politics and become a White House staffer without sacrificing his cultural strength, if you will. That sort of thing just couldn't happen today. Look at what's going on with David Mamet right now. You can't say his name without getting someone angry because he's waded into the arena, criticizing liberalism and so forth. And even, I still can't believe it, defending Trump. For a writer to imagine the theatrical world of Robert Sherwood and this type of play in the context of our theater today is really, it's almost as remote as Shakespeare's theater was to the theater of the American 20th century. If you think about the way that Shakespeare's plays were produced, with the King's Men, Shakespeare being a member of both an acting and financial stock company, owning the theater building and so forth, and having royal patronage, that kind of system is as detached from our reality as Sherwood's method of production is detached from our reality, or Shakespeare's was from his own. Perhaps even Shakespeare's method was even closer to Sherwood's than ours. The theater is so different now. Our media are so different now. Also, the kind of genteel sensibility that Sherwood represents is gone. The idea of someone going from Harvard to fighting in the trenches, coming back to being a New York wit, and then becoming a serious playwright. That's something that only a historian is interested in today. And I do want to mention what I consider to be Sherwood's greatest play, The Petrified Forest, which some people may be familiar with because of the movie with Humphrey Bogart and Bette Davis. The movie that made Humphrey Bogart a star and also solidified Bette Davis's stature as an A-list star for Warner Brothers. This play has a lot of the same ideas that are expressed in There Shall Be No Night, but I would argue that the timeliness that the petrified forest represents, sort of the last gasp of the lost generation, has gone beyond timeliness. The sense of disillusion and despair, the desperate hope to affect society somehow, I think is ripe for revival. And while it does have a relatively large cast, it certainly wouldn't have, it's a one set, it's set in a restaurant, a roadside restaurant. I think the ideas of the failed lost generation writer, Alan, who's desperate to, walk to the Pacific Ocean and drown himself in it because he feels that all he has were ideals that have no place in the world today. Very much speaking for Sherwood of that time, a stance he would repudiate with plays with There Shall Be No Night. Also, it's interesting that John Mason Brown, the drama critic who was Sherwood's greatest champion, who was working on the second volume of A Life of Robert E. Sherwood, unfortunately died in the midst of writing the second volume. The publishers came out with volume 2, and the second part of that volume is the published text of There Shall Be No Night. So even in the early 1960s, this was seen as an appropriate memorial. The play was seen as an appropriate memorial to Robert E. Sherwood's legacy.
We'll post a link to Tom's article in the Journal of American Drama and Theater on There Shall Be No Night in our show notes, as well as additional information about the play and about Robert Sherwood's career. Tom, thank you for telling us about this unexpectedly timely play.
Thank you so much. It was delightful.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit theaterhistorypodcast.net and follow @theaterhistory on Twitter. Just a note, theater is spelled TheaterHistory.